Slavery as an institution has existed throughout world history, from ancient Babylon and Rome to the Aztec and the Mongol empires. And whenever there was slavery, there were slave revolts. All of them followed the same pattern. They started out pretty strong until authorities gathered forces and just crushed them. Every single slave revolt in the history of the world has failed, except for one, the Haitian Revolution. What caused it to happen? Why did this one succeed? We're going to find out today in the World History course. The past few lectures have been all building up to today's topic on the Haitian Revolution. In section 1, we saw how European colonizers took over the Caribbean after 1492. In Haiti, that was Spain and then France. And we also saw how those colonizers imposed various forms of forced labor. First, the repartimiento against Native Americans, then indentured servitude against whites, and then finally African slavery, which was the dominant form of labor in French Haiti by the 18th century. And then we also saw how people began to push back against such tyranny. We talked about pirates who refused to accept impressment, and the philosophers of the Enlightenment who thought that power should come from the people, the bottom, not kings and gods at the top. And we also saw how American colonists fought for self-government during the American Revolution after 1776, and how French citizens overthrew the Bourbon monarchs of France after 1789. So remember all this general context as we study the Haitian Revolution, because this was part of the age of Atlantic revolutions. But it also went much further than its US and French counterparts when it came to racial equality, which is what makes it so fascinating to me. One last note before I delve into today's topic, the Haitian Revolution. Don't tell anyone, but as a world history professor, I often talk about topics that I know nothing about. I know just enough about Ming China or the Belgian Congo to do a 1-hour lecture, but that's it. But for once, today I actually know what I'm talking about. The Haitian Revolution is actually my area of expertise, the field where I do in-depth research as an academic. Which, now that I think of it, might be a bit of a challenge, because I will have to summarize a massive, sprawling, complex event into a tight narrative. That's not too long, but I'll try. So let's start with the first obvious question. What caused the Haitian Revolution to begin? And you'll think, these are slaves. Of course they revolted. But surprisingly, the first people to revolt in Haiti were not the slaves, but the French colonists, the white planters. And that's odd. I mean, why were they so unhappy with a system that so benefited them? Well, for one thing, 18th century France was not a democracy. Instead, it was an absolute monarchy by divine right. So every decision was taken by the king in France and then passed on to its subjects. So in the case of the colony of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti as we know it today, the minister of the navy in Versailles was the person in charge. And then he would appoint a governor and an intendant to go to Saint-Domingue itself, and those two men who ruled in the name of the minister and the king. So the white planters in Haiti, who otherwise were all powerful when dealing with their slaves, they were powerless when dealing with royal officials sent from France. And for that reason, they referred to the colonial system as a ministerial dictatorship. They were under the dictatorial rule of the minister of the navy, and there was something unfair about it. The colonists also complained about the exclusifs, which were trade restrictions imposed by France. And under the mercantilist trade theories of the 18th century, remember that from section 1, colonies existed to enrich the mother country, in that case, France. So colonies could only export goods like sugarcane to France and then import goods like foodstuffs from France, even if the price of sugar was higher on British markets, or if foodstuffs were cheaper if you imported them from the US. So that would cut into the profits of the planters. French planters, who were unhappy with that lack of self-government and all these trading restrictions, they had a solution right in front of them: the United States of America. Because, well, the colonists of Saint-Domingue were well aware of the American Revolution. In fact, as a French colony, in the 1770s and 80s, Haiti had sent white and colored troops to fight in the US War of Independence in Savannah, for example. So when the US won its War of Independence in 1783, the white colonists of Haiti figured, wow, US planters are now independent, They have their own government, and that's better than the ministerial dictatorship that we got in Haiti. And now apparently US planters can trade with whomever they want, so no mercantilism for them. That's great too. And even better, American planters like Jefferson and Washington, they apparently managed to break free from Britain without upsetting the very social system that had made them rich. The independent US was still dominated by rich white planters. So that's what the rich white planters of Haiti were hoping to do, to replicate the American Revolution in Haiti, which is to say to get political autonomy from the mother country, to get free trade, and at the same time to keep slavery, an incomplete kind of revolution. Obviously, there was one major difference. It is that in the US, the proportion of slaves was rarely more than 50% of the population in a given state, and far less than that in northeastern states like Pennsylvania, whereas in Saint-Domingue or Haiti, slaves were 90% of the population. So starting a revolt or revolution in that context, that was kind of like playing with matches while sitting on top of a keg of gunpowder. But the white planters of Haiti, they were confident that they could revolt against France and still maintain slavery. And we'll see soon how that worked out for them. So in 1789, when France began its own revolution, colonists in Haiti figured, well, now is the time to strike. France is too busy to fight back. So the white colonies began to become more and more unruly against France. They set up their own assemblies. They drafted their own constitution. They even forced the French governor to flee from the capital in Port-au-Prince, and then they lynched the commander of the French garrison, physically killed him. And again, it might seem dangerous for white planters in Haiti to start attacking each other when 90% of the population of the colony was enslaved, but they figured, again, based on the US precedent, that they could get away with it. The second most prominent group in Haiti was the free population of color. And I'm talking here not about the slaves, I'm talking about people who had obtained their freedom either by purchasing it from their master or maybe because they were mixed race people who were the descendants of white planters who had sex with their African slaves. So roughly 5% of the Haitian population in colonial times was free people of color. So we're talking about a significant group here. Those people were not in favor of the abolition of slavery. In fact, many of these free people of color, they made money the same way that others did in the colony, which is to say they bought land, they bought some slaves, and they exploited those slaves on plantations. So these former slaves, or descendants of slaves, they could be slave owners themselves. And that may seem a bit weird, but white planters were the role model in the colony in Haiti. So free people of color, they aspired to be French planters. They joined the Catholic Church, they dressed like French people, they spoke Parisian French, and they exploited slaves. It was true elsewhere in other colonies in the Caribbean too. But as racism became more ingrained in 18th century Haiti, there was a raft of racist segregationist laws that were imposed in Haiti to put the free people of color in their place. So some of these laws might say to mixed race women of Haiti, you cannot dress too well, you have to wear simple dresses of white cotton. Or mixed race men might be told you cannot wear a sword because only a person who is white can do that. Or if you go to the theater, which was a favorite pastime in Haiti, you cannot sit in the same section as white people do. So think of the Jim Crow laws in the US South. And these laws came as a shock to the mixed race population because they saw themselves more as Europeans than Africans, and to them was almost Oedipian. They were rejected by their white father. So as far as their political agenda was concerned, maybe pause the video for a second and ask yourself, what is it that you think the free population of color might have wanted in the run-up to the revolution in Haiti? Well, not the abolition of slavery, because again, many of them owned slaves. But what they wanted was the end of legal discrimination against them. Legal equality for all free people, regardless of their race, black or mixed race or white. So when the French Revolution came along, those free people of color in Haiti were very excited to hear about the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Remember from the previous lecture how Article 1 said, all men are created and remain free and equal in rights. It didn't say all white men, it said all men. So free people of color thought that they would get equal rights as part of the French Revolution. Specifically, there was one man called Vincent Auger. He was a quadroon, meaning 1/4 African, so light-skinned, a slave owner, very rich, well-educated, and Auger traveled to France in 1789 to ask the French National Assembly to formally declare that free people, like himself, they were equal to white planters, that they were citizens, regardless of their race. But the French National Assembly chickened out. They shelved the issue because they were afraid of upsetting the white colonists of Haiti who were already threatening to declare independence, remember. So Vincent Auger, having failed to get what he wanted in France, legal equality, he headed back to Haiti. So he gathered up 300 supporters, rich free people of color like himself, and they raised the banner of revolt in the fall of 1790. And those 300 were too few to impose their will, so they eventually fled to what is today the Dominican Republic, the Spanish colony next door, only to be extradited back to Haiti, put on trial for sedition, and then sentenced to death. And I won't go into the details because those details are quite gruesome, but basically Vincent Auger was broken up on a wheel and left to die in agony. All that because he wanted to be a French citizen like white people. And 3 of his grandparents, remember, were white. He was a quadroon. So you can see how other free people of color would be outraged by this because they had asked for equality from France and couldn't get it. So by this point, we haven't gotten yet to the third group of the colony revolting, and that would be the most important one, numerically speaking, the enslaved population, 90% of the total. And to understand why they would revolt, that's pretty easy. They were slaves, after all. And we saw in the 2 previous lectures how Africans were brought forcibly as part of the Atlantic slave trade and then brutally exploited on plantations. And we also saw how the Code Noir, the black code that regulated slavery in French colonies, well, that normally shielded the slave from the worst cases of abuse, but in practice, those provisions were typically not enforced. So for example, Nicolas Lejeune, a coffee planter in Haiti, who tortured 2 of his female slaves to death, well, somehow he got away with it when the matter went to court. So if you were a slave in Haiti, the one way that you could protect yourself would be eventually to revolt. And there was a long history of slave revolts in the 18th century Caribbean, not just in Haiti. And the Haitian Revolution, that's a direct continuation of that, just a bigger form of revolt. Though surprisingly, when you look at the agenda, many of the rebel slaves of Haiti did not want to end slavery altogether, at least at first. Why? Well, those slaves, they came from Africa, where slavery also existed. And they lived in the Caribbean, where slavery existed everywhere. So those rebel slaves, they had a hard time imagining a world where men had an innate right to be free, where freedom was universal. That would have required a complete shift of paradigm. So Haitian slaves, when they revolted initially, they only demanded better treatment, maybe, I don't know, a 3-day weekend that would give them more time to tend to their own gardens and so get a better diet for their family. But the universal abolition of slavery, that was not yet on their radar when the slaves revolted in 1791. In fact, even the philosophers of the Enlightenment back in France, they were not adamant about abolishing slavery either. Their main focus was limiting the powers of the French king. So when you read the works of Voltaire and Montaigne and all these people we studied earlier, the issue of slavery was just a footnote for them. And even the Abbé Grégoire, the founding member of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks in Paris, which was a kind of a lobbying group for racial equality, he only asked for racial equality for free people of color, and maybe ending the slave trade at some point in the future. But immediately abolishing slavery, that still seemed like a radical idea as of 1790-91, even for the Abbé Grégoire. And that was a Haitian Revolution that changed all that. So all right, so now we know why the 3 main groups in Haiti were upset and why the situation reached fever pitch after 1789 because of the outbreak of the French Revolution, which weakened French authority and opened a window of opportunity for would-be rebels. Now let's move on to the revolution itself. I already mentioned the white unrest that built up after 1789 and then the failed revolt of Vincent Auger in 1790. So the true beginning of the Haitian Revolution, that's usually dated to August of 1791, which is when the slaves revolted. Books on the topic, they always begin with the Boa Caiman Ceremony that took place right before the revolt. A bois, that's a wood, so it took place in a clearing. And it involved a Vodou priest named Boukman and a priestess named Cécile Fatima, as well as representatives from all the plantations of the area in northern Haiti. Oh, and it was a dark and stormy night. So Cécile Fatima, the voodoo priestess, she helped sacrifice a black pig to the voodoo god of war, Ogun, After which the voodoo priest, Bookman, he made a long speech to explain that Ogun wanted the slaves to revolt and kill the planters and seize the colony for themselves. And all the people who were present then drank the warm blood of the pig and made a sacred oath to revolt together or die trying. And at that point, the storm finally broke out. There was a tropical downpour, lightning everywhere, very dramatic. And then all the slaves, drenched in blood and sweat and rain, they headed back to their plantation, and the next day, the Haitian Revolution began. That's a great story, but as a student of history, you always need to be skeptical about these stories. Critical thinking. How do we know all of that? Do you think that among the mass of illiterate slaves, there was a secretary in the corner diligently taking notes of the meaning? No, especially when plotting a secret conspiracy. So how do we know all these details? Well, the first account of the meeting popped up 20 years later, and that was written by a white colonist. So obviously he had not been invited to the ceremony. So at best, his account was based on hearsay. And some of the stuff he clearly made up. In the account by the white colonist, the voodoo priest Bookman made his speech in formal French, in Alexandrine verse, which sounds pretty unlikely. So based on the documents from the archives, we know for sure that some gathering of slaves took place, 2 actually, and that's it. The rest of the story was just made up. It's myth more than history. But it's such a great story that historians keep repeating it, often adding more spurious details as they go. And I followed in their footsteps. But the slave revolt that followed right after the Boa Caiman Ceremony, well, however, that was very real. To give you a point of comparison, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, that took place north of New Orleans in 1811, and that involved about 500 slaves altogether. The Haitian Revolution involved all the slaves of the northern plain of Haiti, so 50,000 slaves, 100 times as many as the one in New Orleans. And ultimately, the slave revolt involved every slave in Haiti, 500,000 people, making it 1,000 times larger than the largest slave revolt in the history of the United States. And Haiti was not just some random little island. That was the richest plantation colony in the Americas and the leading exporter of sugar and coffee in the world. So, kind of a big deal. The initial plan was for all the slaves of the Northern Plain to revolt at the same time as the slaves inside the big port of Cap Français. Because the colonial assembly was meeting in town, so in one fell swoop, you could decapitate the entire white leadership of the colony. A great plan. Except it did not exactly unfold as planned. A few impatient hotheads started attacking their planners before the official date, and so the revolt began in haphazard fashion and was less successful than it could have been. But still, it was a major slave revolt. Several hundred plantations went up in flames, 300 planters were killed, often in gruesome fashion. And obviously, those planters had inflicted horrible atrocities on the slaves before, so that kind of raises a philosophical issue. Is violence ever justified when it's in response to previous violence? What about all the children who got killed during the revolt in 1791? Did they do anything to deserve that? Or are they indirectly complicit on account of their class and their race, or just collateral damage in a righteous war for liberty? I'll let you decide. Because the plan of revolt was not followed to a T, the city of Cap Français, the port, that remained in French hands. Even at the plantation, the area, the plain went up in flames. So just like Pompeii, the volcano erupted, except in that case, instead of lava, that would be burning sugar cane that went high up in the sky and then cooled down, and then ashes fell all over the city of Cap. Again, very dramatic. Somebody in Hollywood should really make a good movie about it and then hire me as a historical consultant. So what allowed this particular slave revolt in Haiti to succeed when others have failed throughout the Caribbean or history in general? Well, the demographic imbalance for one. Slaves in Haiti were 20 times more numerous than whites. Also, the timing was good. In 1791, the white minority in Haiti was busy fighting itself, and then France was too busy with its own revolution back in Europe to send some extensive reinforcements. Last and not least, we should also mention the courage of the slaves who started this revolt, even though the odds were not in their favor. And it was pretty clear, based on historical precedents, that they would fail and then die some horrible deaths. But don't always do things based on what you learn in a history book. Sometimes people manage against the odds to change the course of world history. That's called a revolution. Now let's move on to the events of the following years, because the revolution was far from over either in France or in Haiti. There's actually an interesting back and forth in the 1790s between the French and the Haitian revolutions. Initially, the Haitian Revolution began in reactions to events in France, like the Code Noir or the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But then the 1791 slave revolt in Haiti, that forced France to act as well. In 1792, in response to the slave revolt, the French Parliament finally granted legal equality to free people of color, what Vincent Auger has asked about, hoping to get those people on the French side against the slave rebellion. But then events in France again had an impact in Haiti. In 1793, France executed the French king, Louis XVI, and so the major monarchies of Europe declared war on France. And as part of that war, Britain and Spain, they attacked French colonies in the Caribbean. So the British invaded the main ports of Haiti by sea, places like the capital, Port-au-Prince, while the Spanish invaded inland from their colony in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic today. The man who was unlucky enough to be ruling Haiti for France at that time was named Léger Félicité Sonthonax. That's the portly fellow that you see over there. He faced quite a difficult situation. A good chunk of the white colonists in Haiti just hated him because they wanted to secede from France. He also faced, obviously, a major slave revolt involving 90% of the population. And as if this were not enough, he now had to face an invasion by the other two main colonial powers in the Caribbean, Britain and Spain. And by the way, don't expect reinforcement from France as long as the British Navy rules the seas. And whatever troops he had would succumb to yellow fever. So try to put yourself in his silver-buckled shoes for a second and ask yourself, what would you have done in his case? Huh? Well, he could not fight everyone at the same time, so he sought to turn some enemies into allies. He figured, let's align myself with who? Well, the black majority. What is it that they want? They want freedom, right? So I will grant them that freedom, sign an abolition proclamation, in exchange for which I will expect black freedmen to join the French army and help me fight white monarchists, internal enemies, and foreign invaders, the alien enemies. So in 1793, Sonthonax signed an Emancipation Proclamation, which was a major turning point, not just in Haiti, but in world history. Notice the date, 1793. The British did not abolish slavery in their Caribbean colonies until 1833, 40 years later. As for the US, it was not until 1865 and the Civil War that all slaves were freed. While Brazil, the other major slaveholder in the Americas, only abolished slavery in 1888. So Haiti was 50 to 100 years ahead of its time. Once Sonthonax abolished slavery, he did so without the approval of his government back in France. In fact, he had been sent to Haiti by France to quell the slave revolt, not abolish slavery. So with just a stroke of his quill, he had freed 500,000 slaves, valued at 2,000 livres a head. So basically, he had cost French investors 1 billion livres, to look at it in monetary terms. So Sonthonax, he wasn't sure how the French government would react to his radical decision to free the slaves of Haiti. So it were the days of the terror, remember, in France, where people were being sent to the guillotine right and left for no reason. So Sonthonax very courageously decided that he would remain in Haiti and then send other people to France to give the news. So he selected 3 deputies, one of them white, one of them mixed race, and one of them black, which nicely symbolized the 3 major racial components of the colony. Those 3 men made their way to the National Assembly in France, and they weren't sure how they would be received, either with laurels as heralds of freedom, or with the cold blade of the guillotine as traitors. Well, as it turned out, laurels. This was the radical, idealistic phase of the revolution, so the French deputies figured, yes, you're right, all men are created for equal rights. It was right there in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man years ago. And we've been procrastinating for years, but the revolt in Haiti has forced us to realize that slavery is incompatible with the principles of the Enlightenment. So the French deputies in 1794 endorsed the abolition decree that Sonthonax had passed in Haiti the year before, and then they raised him 2 more. First, the French deputies abolished slavery in all French colonies, not just in Haiti. And 2, they declared that former slaves would now be more than freedmen. All of them, even those born in Africa, would now become citizens of France. Well, all the men, at least, since women, whether white or black, still didn't have the full right to vote in France. So that was a radical moment. I already mentioned how emancipation in the rest of the Americas came much later. And even when people became free in places like the US, they had to wait another 100 years to gain the right to vote in the 1960s. So this meant that the black man who had been sent with the Haitian delegation, Jean-Baptiste Bellé, who had once been a slave, possibly born in Senegal, Africa, now became Haiti's official representative in parliament, i.e. the first black deputy in the history of France. Politicians, they often have to pick between what is right and what is practical, idealism and realpolitik. The 1794 Law of Abolition in France was a rare case when the two went hand in hand. Emancipation, that was the right thing to do. But also allowed France, which otherwise was on the defensive due to British mastery of the seas, to enroll black freedmen all over the Caribbean and turn them into soldiers of freedom. One French official called Victor Hugues went to the island of Guadeloupe with supposedly just a guillotine and a piece of paper with a law abolishing slavery. And those two symbols of the revolution were enough to convince the black majority of Guadeloupe to rally to his side and help kick out the British from that French colony. And back in Haiti, many slave rebels also joined the French side now that they were accepted as free and equal citizens. The most famous person to switch sides around that time was Toussaint Louverture. He's a fascinating figure. In fact, I've dedicated my whole career to exploring his life. You'll have to read the whole book to get the full story, wink wink, but basically he was born a slave on a sugar plantation of northern Haiti and became the most famous leader of the Haitian Revolution. He fought on the side of the rebel slaves for a while, and then Spain for a while, but he eventually joined the French side sometime after France abolished slavery in 1794. With his help, the French were able to kick out the British and Spanish invaders and save all of Haiti for France. But a very different Haiti, a colony where now black people were no longer slaves, but citizens, and in fact played leadership roles throughout the colonial army and the bureaucracy, like Toussaint Louverture did. So to get back to a question that I raised earlier, how come Haiti is the one place in the world where a slave revolt succeeded? And as often in history, it's a combination of factors. One is ideology. The Enlightenment laid the foundation for the concept of universal freedom. Then you have historical context. The revolution in France opened a window of opportunity for the rebels of Haiti. Then you have the epidemiological context. Remember from the lecture on the Columbian Exchange that yellow fever was an endemic disease in Haiti, which killed European newcomers far more than local black Creoles. So France and Britain and Spain, they sent one army after another to Haiti, and all of them were wiped out by disease. So in a way, mosquitoes freed the people of Haiti. And then you have human agency, the leadership factor. People like Boukman and Toussaint Louverture and all these courageous rebel slaves were able to reshape history. So what happened after that? What happened to all the plantations now that they were no longer slaves? And did the revolution endure? Well, we're only about halfway through the narratives because amazingly the most dramatic moments of the revolution were yet to come. But basically the answer to all these questions is Toussaint Louverture. After joining the French army in 1794, he earned the rank of general in the French army, and then he elbowed out various French officials like Sonthonax, and then he became the de facto ruler of the whole colony by 1798. So he was the man in charge. One important thing to know about Toussaint Louverture is that he was not your typical Haitian rebel. He was not an African, but a Creole, meaning that he was born in Haiti of African-born parents. Also, he was not young. Slaves died young in Haiti, but he was a survivor who managed to survive and was pushing 50 by the time the revolution began. So he grew up on a sugar plantation in Haiti. He did not suffer quite as much as some other slaves did because he did not toil in the fields. Instead, he took care of the animals as a caretaker. Also, he managed to strike a good relationship with the white manager of the plantation where he lived, so eventually he earned his manumission, his freedom. So Toussaint Louverture was actually already free before the revolution began. And in fact, once he earned his freedom, he leased a small plantation, including the slaves that were on it, and bought some slaves of his own. And that was pretty common practice for free people of color in Haiti, but quite shocking for the future leader of the slave revolt. And I'm mentioning all of that to explain why, when Louverture became the leader of the Haitian Revolution, he was a far more complex figure than you would expect. A former slave for sure, and a rebel, but also one who was not as radically opposed to the plantation system as some of his brothers and sisters in arms. What to do with the plantation of Haiti, that was the main issue by the late 1790s. after Louverture expelled foreign invaders and the colony enjoyed a short period of peace. And there were basically two options. Louverture could either grant complete freedom to the former slaves and let them do whatever they wanted, which in their case meant subsistence farming. Break up the large plantations into small subsistence plots, grow a few plantains and chickens, and live happily ever after. So complete freedom, but also economic ruin for the colony that relied on exports of sugar and coffee. The other extreme option would be to restore slavery and force field hands to continue working on the plantations. A betrayal of the ideal of the revolution, obviously, but it also allowed Louverture to revive the plantation sector, which had been ravaged during the slave revolt. And notice that during the revolution, Louverture had acquired dozens of plantations in his own name, so he had a personal vested financial incentive to get people to work. So which of these two options do you think he picked, or what would you have picked? Complete freedom and ruin, or restoring slavery and betraying the revolution? Think about it for a second. The answer is none of the above, or rather something in between. Toussaint Louverture settled on an intermediate system known as the Cultivator System, a bit like serfdom in medieval Europe, if you took my early world history class, or the Repartimiento System, or the indentured servitude system that we studied in section 1. On the one hand, slavery under Toussaint Louverture would no longer exist by law, period, and the whip would also be abolished. But then former slaves would have to continue working on their former plantation, whether they wanted to or not. But then they would be paid a portion of the crop. So cultivators would be free, but they would be free to work. And many ex-slaves balked at this halfway system, and they resisted the cultivator system. It's as if the revolution of Haiti had done what would be more like a cosmic revolution, like a planet around the sun, going very far away from the initial start, and then it had gone all the way back to the beginning and its starting point. But Toussaint Louverture was convinced that this was the only way for the colony to thrive. Crops like sugarcane and coffee, they were the only exports in Haiti. And his entire regime relied on taxes levied from those exports. That's how he financed his army, i.e. the one thing that could protect Haitians from the enemies of freedom who were already talking about re-enslaving people in Haiti. Also, according to Toussaint Louverture, every racist in the world was waiting for Haiti to fail. So he was adamant that Haitians should create a functioning regime under himself to prove that black people were smart and that they could rule themselves. And because Haiti was the first colony in the region to abolish slavery, it was a case study, an experiment, a city upon a hill. So Toussaint Louverture was adamant that he would make the plantation system work by force if necessary. And this made him a rather controversial figure in his time. People admired him as a successful and a smart ruler. Many in the black base, the field hands, they saw him as a tool, a tyrant, a person who had betrayed the idealistic impulses of the revolution and brought them back almost to the days of the old Code Noir. Another big issue of the time was, will there be another Haiti, meaning another revolution, somewhere else? After all, slavery continued elsewhere in the Americas, including right here in the US, so would similar revolts pop up in the Caribbean or the US? And that was not just an empty question. Back in Europe, France had been quite aggressive in terms of exporting the ideal of the French Revolution to other countries by force of arms if necessary. France even sent orders to Toussaint Louverture that he should do the same in the Americas, that he should use black soldiers from Haiti to invade Jamaica or Cuba or the US and then abolish slavery there. So what did Toussaint Louverture do? Well, he did the exact opposite. He sent an ambassador to Philadelphia, which was the US capital back then, to meet with President John Adams and sign a treaty of non-aggression. And he did the same with the British in Jamaica. And when a young Jewish idealist from Haiti went to Jamaica to start a slave revolt there, Toussaint Louverture even went as far as leaking the plans to the British so that the Jewish conspirator would be arrested and executed. So he actively opposed orders from France to export the cause of emancipation. Why did he do so? Again, he was being practical. He was afraid that if he angered his British and American neighbors, i.e. the two countries with the most powerful navies in the Caribbean, they would impose an economic embargo, and he would never be able to restore the plantation economy. So he promised not to start a slave revolt in Jamaica or the US, in exchange for which the British and the Americans agreed to trade with him. So he safeguarded the revolution in Haiti, but at the expense of abandoning the other slaves of the Americans to their fate. And that's a common conundrum for revolutions. Do you want to focus on the success of your own revolution at home, or do you want to try and spread the revolution worldwide, whatever the risks? Later, we'll study the Russian Revolution in the 20th century, and where the communist leader Joseph Stalin also made a conscious decision to have revolution in one country alone, only in Russia. So by 1801, Louverture was all-powerful in Haiti. He had kicked out the British and the Spanish invaders. He had forced the cultivators back to the plantations, more or less. He had reduced French colonial officials to impotence, and he had eliminated all his local rivals, especially a mixed-race general named André Rigaud, who was a big rival for a while. And then he even invaded the nearby colony of Santo Domingo, the Spanish half of the island of Hispaniola. And then, to cap it off, in 1801, he issued a constitution that made him Governor General for life of the whole island of Hispaniola. Not bad for a person who had once been a slave, i.e. somebody who had not controlled his own body, let alone the whole island of Hispaniola. So just to be clear, the French colony, Haiti, was not supposed to have its own constitution, and Toussaint Louverture could not make himself Governor General for life unilaterally. France, as a colonial power, had that power, but France was too busy fighting the war in Europe to do much about it. Even though he was all-powerful by 1801, Toussaint Louverture, however, never formally declared independence from France. In fact, he insisted that he was still a loyal servant of the French government, even as he sought autonomy in practice. So why was he acting in that ambiguous way, you might ask? Well, for one thing, it was part of his character. He was a cautious, even devious kind of figure. Also, he had a large family, including two sons, whom he had sent to Paris to study, and he feared that if he ever declared independence from France, well, he might never see his sons again. Toussaint Louverture can be a hard man to figure out because he hid his thoughts very well. He would have been extremely good at playing poker. But there's one thing that is for sure. He loved his family, and he did not want to lose his sons. So that was the situation by 1801. Haiti was ruled by a larger-than-life character who had managed to free the slaves and revive the plantation economy, but in a way that made him controversial, both with his black base and his French overlord. And it's now time to cross the Atlantic yet again and figure out how France would react to the daring constitution passed by Toussaint Louverture. And by France, I mean Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken over in 1799. Napoleon was not yet emperor, he was just the first consul of France, which basically meant dictator of France, kind of like Louverture was in Haiti. In fact, the two were remarkably similar, both of them going from insular obscurity in Haiti and Corsica to absolute power. Both of them soldiers, both of them conservative revolutionaries, if that makes any sense. Both of them womanizers, etc. Toussaint Louverture is often described as the Black Napoleon, or maybe you could call Napoleon the White Toussaint. At any rate, by 1801, Napoleon became convinced that Toussaint Louverture was on a path to independence. And as it happened, right then and there in 1801, there was a brief period of peace with Britain, and that opened the seas of the Atlantic to the French Navy. And so Napoleon was able to send a massive expedition to Haiti that year. And I mean massive. Altogether, France sent some 43,000 troops to Haiti under Napoleon, along with 2/3 of the French Navy and sailors that went with it. And they were headed by Napoleon's own brother-in-law, the General Leclerc, who was the husband of his favorite sister Pauline, who also went with the expedition. And there is some historical debate on what Napoleon's intentions were when sending that expedition. Clearly, he wanted to overthrow Toussaint Louverture and restore direct French white rule. But did he want to restore slavery as well? And I was not able to find direct evidence for that in my research. But then Napoleon also sent massive expeditions to other French islands in the Caribbean, like Guadeloupe, and he eventually restored slavery there, so that was definitely a possibility in the long run. Toussaint Louverture, for his part, he was convinced that the French had come to Haiti not just to overthrow him, but to restore slavery. And so he tried to rally the black people of Haiti behind him to oppose the French landing. But many black field hands were angry at him because he had forced them back to the plantations under the Cultivator System, and so many of his black countrymen abandoned him when the Leclerc expedition landed in Haiti early in 1802. The next 2 years, they were a very complicated time with a lot of upheavals. So if you want to know the details, I'll just refer you to another book of mine, The Slaves Who Defeated Napoleon, which covers the Leclerc expedition in great detail. But here's an executive summary. General Leclerc was initially successful at defeating Louverture, capturing him, and sending him to exile in France, where Toussaint Louverture spent a few miserable months in a frigid cell at the Fort de Joux before he died of sorrow and pneumonia. You can actually visit the cell where he died. And also, if you want to look at the beginning of the story, the remnants of the plantation in Haiti where he grew up. Meanwhile, back in the Caribbean, after the exile of Toussaint Louverture, other Haitians continued to fight against the French because they were convinced that they were about to be re-enslaved. They were led by a man called Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who had been before that the second in command under Toussaint Louverture, and long before that, the slave of the son-in-law of Toussaint Louverture. Kind of a long story. But anyway, that period of the revolution, 1802-1803, that was marked by incredible violence, even by the standards of the Haitian Revolution. Basically, French General Leclerc, he concluded that the black Haitians had tasted freedom for 10 years and that they could never be pacified or re-enslaved. And so it was best to completely exterminate all the adult Haitians and start from scratch. As a result, his opponent, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, decided that he would have to wage a war to the death against the French. So mass drowning, executions, you name it, plenty of atrocities. Yellow fever, that was still as deadly as ever, and the Haitians fought bravely, so eventually it was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Haitian side, who won the war and forced the remnants of the Leclerc expedition out of the colony. And then on January 1st of 1804, the Haitians formally declared their independence, and that's still the national holiday all the way to the present time. And then the Haitian Revolution came to an end. Notice the Haitian flag, in many ways that looks like the French flag. There's some blue and some red, as well as various symbols of liberty modeled after French revolutionary iconography. But notice also that the central white strip is missing, and that's because Haiti saw itself as revolutionary France, but without white people. And I don't mean that just metaphorically. Shortly after independence, Jean-Jacques Dessalines decided to kill all remaining whites in Haiti, what legally would be considered a genocide today, but the term did not exist back then. Whatever the name they use, those events in 1804, the massacre of the white minority, that cast a long shadow. Because Haiti, as the only black-led, slave-free regime in the region, kind of became a political pariah in the region. In a way, it still is to the present time. Those white colonists who did manage to escape in time, often they headed to New Orleans, Louisiana, where a big group of Haitian colonists arrived in 1809. So a lot of people in southeast Louisiana, whether white or black, can trace their roots back to the Haitian Revolution. What about the issue that had been preoccupying Louverture, creating a successful post-emancipation society in Haiti? Well, the story is less glorious there after 1804. Jean-Jacques Dessalines tried to maintain the Cultivator System after independence, but it was so unpopular that this system eventually died out, as did the plantation sector. And so Haiti became a very poor country, which it still is today. And there are a variety of reasons for that poverty, and I wrote yet another book about it. But one of them is the difficulty for Haitians of transitioning to a post-emancipation society in the 1790s and 1800s. I want to end this lecture by trying to situate the Haitian Revolution within the general context of the Haitian revolutions, i.e. what we're doing in this section. We saw how the philosophers of the Enlightenment, they often talked about freedom, but then they shied away from attacking slavery head-on. And if you read the U.S. Declaration of Independence, in your primary source workbook, you'll see that Thomas Jefferson, he talked a lot about self-government and liberty, but for rich white males only. He did not plan on freeing his own slaves. So the American Revolution changed a lot of things, but it stopped short of racial equality. As for France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is also in your workbook, that was more ambitious. In fact, the French Revolution, under pressure from Haiti, eventually declared that all men, regardless of their race, are free and equal in rights. But then Napoleon reneged on that promise, so it's a cup half full when it comes to whether the French Revolution led to racial equality. The term revolution, that normally entails a complete reordering of the social order from top to bottom, but in the US and France, the revolution ended with white planters or white bourgeois in France, not completely reordering society. The most radical of all these three revolutions, and the only one to truly upend the ranks of society, would be the Haitian Revolution. If you read the 1804 Declaration of Independence, which also is in your workbook, you'll see how Jean-Jacques Dessalines pushed the ideals of the Enlightenment to their extreme, and adamantly proclaimed the right of black Haitians to be free. Former slaves were now in charge, a more radical revolution. Well, I could go on for hours, but that is a lot to process already, so I'll stop here. Next time we're going to be heading to Britain, and we'll study a very different kind of revolution, not a political one, but an economic one, the Industrial Revolution. Goodbye, au revoir.